Before I start the talk, I just want to introduce myself. I'm David Powe, and you can see I'm a vicar. And it's amazing the reaction you get when you wear one of these. I can clear a bar at 30 feet. I walk in the bar and people just move out of the way. It's like parting the Red Sea. People just get out of the way. Look out, there's a vicar in the pub. That's it. And sometimes, there's one thing about it. You can certainly get a seat on a train. I sit on the train sometimes, and if there's one seat beside me and my son, I've got two sons here tonight, I've got Thomas and Edward, and if one of them is with me or two of them with me, and there's a spare seat beside me, and you see everybody hanging onto the bars and things like that, onto the straps and on the luggage racks, and there's a spare seat, Edward will turn around and say, "Dad, don't embarrass me." Thomas will say, "Dad, don't say anything." I say, "It's too late. Anybody want to sit next to a vicar?" And you know, they all go like this, all turn the other way. I try to be encouraging. I say, "Sit down, I'll read you something," and nobody will sit next to me. But you can see I'm Church of England, C of E. You see, I've worked 25 years in prisons. That's my main ministry, been 25 years in prisons, and people used to put on their doors, C of E. And I used to go in there and say, "You C of E or C and E?" And I said, "What do it mean?" I said, "One's Church of England, one's Christmas and Easter. What are you?" But as I say, I've been working a long time in prisons, and I worked in Belmarsh Prison in southeast London. I used to live in Sidcup. I know many of you come from that area, Orpington and Sidcup and around there, so I know the area well. And I worked in Lewes Prison in Sussex, and I've worked in Bristol Prison, where we live at the moment. And I've also worked in women's prisons, so I've had a vast variety of prisons and so forth. But tonight I want to give you some encouragement. And I want to read just a few verses from Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9, beginning at verse 1. Luke chapter 9. If you've got your Bibles there, turn to Luke chapter 9, beginning at verse 1. When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. He told them, "Take nothing for the journey. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra tunic. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, shake the dust off your feet, and when you leave their town, as a testimony against them." So they set out and went from village to village, preaching the gospel and healing people everywhere. Wherever Christians come together to pray, to worship, like we've been doing earlier on this evening, to read his word, to listen to the word, Jesus is among them. Matthew 18 says, "Where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst." And Jesus is here tonight. And he's here and he's looking down on everybody's heart and everybody's soul and everybody's mind, and he's interested in you as a person. And whatever context we're in, this can be a glorious experience. You're here tonight all together sharing in God's love, feeling his forgiveness and welcome. It's a good place to be. And it's not a good place to be sometimes when you come into the prison. In the prison, we used to have chapel services on a Sunday morning, and we used to have so many people wanted to come to chapel. We used to have 3 services on a Sunday. But they weren't like this type of church or anything like that. People came in all at once. They were brought in all at once. And they were told to sit down and so forth. And you knew when you looked around that many of them had never been to church before. They all sat at the front. Nobody does that. If you notice, nobody does that in churches. Church of England has pillars, especially for people, so they can hide behind them. That's why we have pillars in the Church of England. You know, Church of England, we have front rows are for latecomers. "Oh dear, sitting in front of me," and so forth. If you notice, it's the only place in churches where we love somebody sitting in front of us. It's amazing, isn't it? We sit there and we think, "Oh my goodness, I'm in near the front. There's nobody in front of me." And some big man comes and sits right in front of you. You think, "Thank goodness for that." Even if you've been coming to the church for 40 years, it doesn't matter. You still want somebody to sit in front of you. You go to a cinema or a theatre, you hate it. But in a church, we love people sitting in front of us. And these people used to come to church. And we used to give them just like you've done, we do some worship songs. And we, just as the lady read the Psalms and the short psalm, we used to read a Psalms and so forth. We used to read a psalm. And then I used to give a short talk, a little Bible story. Daniel in the lion's den or something like that. They didn't realize that he got eaten or not. So they were sitting at the edge of their seats to find out what happened. They thought this was really exciting. You know, I mean, this is great. And this is what they wanted to hear. They'd never heard the gospel message before. I'm sure you found peace and love this week, and you will return refreshed and uplifted to your homes, perhaps looking forward to the next gathering. But let's look at Luke. Let's look and see what it says exactly for us. When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. You see, Jesus called his disciples together just as you're gathered together here tonight. And then he gave them power and authority to go out and preach and heal. Not a case of, I hope you're all feeling better now. Been to a conference and Jesus suddenly says, well, I hope you feel much better now. You can go back home. Forget all about it. It wasn't a case of self-centered mentality. It's been good here, but be very careful when you go out to the world. It's a very nasty place. It was not a case of Christian faith. It's just a personal thing. I keep very quiet to myself that I've been away on a conference or I've been away with my Bible. I keep it all hidden and quiet. The purpose of coming to a place like this is to receive a commission from God, to receive more of his Holy Spirit, to go out and do something. Many reasons why the prisoners came to chapel on a Sunday morning was that fact that when many of them came forward to accept Christ. At the end of the service, they used to queue up, they used to run forward, they used to climb over the seats. Sometimes I used to hold them out and say, wait, I haven't called you forward yet. And they used to queue up to give their lives to Christ. And then they went back to their cells, to their wings, and they used to tell all the other prisoners about it. And they used to say, you want to come to chapel? And next week, more people used to come to chapel because we had a huge turnover of prisoners. We were bringing in 25 or 30 new people every single day into the prisons. So 25 or 30 new people were moving out, and 25 or 30 new men were coming in, and new people came forward every week. And when they came forward, I used to get them to sign at the back, put their name and number. Obviously, every prisoner has a number, so we can pray for them that week. Or they wanted to go to the Bible study. We used to hold little Bible groups and things like that for people who wanted to learn more about God. And Jim, who's a good friend of mine, is here tonight, and he came around all the 3 prisons, and he started helping them with the Bible stories and so forth. In fact, we started cell groups. Don't let anybody tell you we didn't do cell groups. In the prison, we'll have the patent on cell groups. We had so many cell groups all over the prison. In every cell there was a Bible. And the Bible was open. A lot of the Bibles were open to the Psalms. And they used to read the Psalms, prisoners who could read. And one time there was a man came forward at the end of a service, and he was a very tough inmate, very tough prisoner, been around the block quite a few times. And his name was David Angel. That was his exact name. You think with his name like Angel, he'd be a Christian a long time ago, but he wasn't. He gave his life to Christ at the end of the service. He gave his life to Christ, and nobody could believe it. And he came up to me afterwards. He said, David, he said, please give me a Bible. Now, like many prisoners, he couldn't read and write. So I said to him, David, you can't read and write. He said, give me a Bible. So I gave him a Bible. A few days later, I went down to his cell. I said, how are you getting on with your Bible story? He said, it's fantastic, he said. My cellmate reads me a Bible story every single night. I said, how do you manage to get him to do that? He said, I threatened to beat him up if he didn't. Well, he's a new Christian, isn't he? He didn't realize you don't beat people up to get a Bible story out of them. His cellmate came to Christ. Probably out of fear. But mind you, you read in Genesis, Noah built the ark out of holy fear. It's biblical and absolutely true, and Jim will back me up on this, and so will my sons. The cellmate was named Priest. So I had an angel and a priest in the same cell. And they were two of the greatest evangelists I've ever come across in two of my life. They used to go out to people, get them by the throat, push them against the wall and say, do you want God? And if they said no, they used to squeeze it and say, why not? Don't you think that's a great way of witnessing? It's the direct method. People always say you're not direct enough, David. You've got to be more direct than that. And they went around and they brought loads to Christ, those people, I tell you that. It's so encouraging because Hebrews tells us that faith comes by hearing. It comes by hearing the good news of Jesus Christ. But what are you planning to do tomorrow when you leave here? You've been here a week. What are you planning to do tomorrow? Anything different? You see, there's a tendency to turn Jesus' instructions into a warm and kind of fuzzy message on one hand, or on just a social program on the other. Jesus sends his disciples out in confidence and authority with a message of spiritual hope and physical well-being. And he goes on and he says, take nothing for the journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra tunic. The idea is to travel light. Prisoners understand about traveling light. When they come into the prison, everything's taken away from them, whether they're guilty or innocent. If you're charged with a crime, you're put in the prison and you're still treated the same as everybody else. You can protest your innocence right the way through. A lot of people won't believe you. Some people are innocent in the prisons. I've met a lot of them. But when they come into the prison, you talk about traveling light, a lot of them have lost their jobs. The fact they've been charged with a crime. They've lost their homes. They've lost their wives or girlfriends. They say, I don't want anything to do with you anymore. Or if they're charged with any form of sexual offense, then they've lost their children. They're not allowed to see their children and so forth. Even if they've just charged with those things. There was a man came into the prison. He'd never been in prison before. He was at home one day and his wife said, I'm going to go to one of those car boot sales. And he says, well, I've got a load of stuff in my rucksack upstairs, he said. It's in the wardrobe on the right-hand side at the bottom. He said, take that, he said. There's all sorts of cups and other things in there. And she went upstairs and took the rucksack and took it to the car boot sale. But she'd taken the wrong rucksack. There was another rucksack there, but it had all child pornography and CDs and DVDs and horrible things like that, all in there. And they gave it to the place. And, of course, somebody looked through it, saw it, and reported him to the police. He was arrested, put in the prison. He was in the prison. His wife had to move house because it all got in the press. And nobody wanted to have a paedophile or anybody else to do with children and things like that. And windows were broken and so forth. His wife suffered terribly with that. But later on, that man gave his life to Christ. There was another man who came in and he'd never been in prison before. And he was a happily married man, but his next door neighbor took a shine to him, took a fancy to him. And she encouraged him to have an affair with her. And after weeks and weeks and weeks of asking him and so forth, he kept saying no, and one day he gave in. Reminds you of Joseph in Genesis 39, doesn't it? Gave in, but Joseph didn't give in. He was charged with something else. But this man gave in, and he had sex once with this next door neighbor, and the next door neighbor lady said, if you ever break off this affair, I'll get you charged with rape. And he broke off the affair, and he said he went and confessed to his wife and so forth, and she charged him with rape. He was put in a prison. He got convicted of rape, and the night he got convicted, the wife told me that the next door neighbor had a huge party to celebrate the fact she got him, even though it wasn't true. He's now doing 16 years for something, for one mistake. But whilst he was in prison, he gave his life to Christ. You see, it tends to focus the mind that whilst in prison, they've nothing else to do but lie and think on the bed, because we've had everything taken away from us, and sometimes they're locked in for 23 out of 24 hours a day. People think it's just a holiday camp. I get loads of people saying to me, when I worked in the prison, I've retired from there now, but come in and say, well, prison's just a holiday camp. I said, you want to book 2 weeks? You're welcome. It can be a horrible, dangerous place. If you're put in a cell with 2 or 3 other people in the cell and so forth, and they don't like you, you're banged up there for so many hours a day, 23 hours a day, and they can do all sorts of things to you. You see, we can spend too much time worrying about all the things we can't take with us and leave little time for the things that really do matter. There's things that really matter in this world, and as Christians, we should think about those things. Matthew 6:19 says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there is your heart also. I just wonder tonight whether you need to prioritize that a little bit in your life. And then in verse 4, I read from Luke, it says, whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, shake the dust off your feet, and when you leave their town, as a testimony against them. Now, this is really interesting because as Christians, we spend a great deal of our time thinking about the people we love who are not saved. Quite right. You should do. You should pray for them. You should try and get them to come to Christ. But there's a world of people outside who've never even heard the gospel, who don't know anything about it. And the trouble is, the more times a person hears the gospel of Jesus Christ, the deafer they become. They become more deaf. I'll give you an example. If you go to a car park, years ago, I'm going back 20, 30 years ago, you went to a car park and a car alarm used to sound, you think, my goodness, somebody's breaking into a car. But now, if you're anything like me, you hear a car alarm, think it goes on, not my car. You know full well the likelihood is that somebody's actually touched the car or moved it or something gone wrong with it, and that's why the alarm's gone off. You take no notice because you become deaf to it. Of course, we don't give up on anybody. Read the parable of the persistent widow. In the prison, I found a lot of people who gave their lives to Christ had a member of their family had been praying for them, sometimes for years. And when they gave their lives to Christ, I said, who's been praying for you? Oh, my grandmother prayed for me for years. She died a few years ago and she's gone to heaven. You may not see the results of your prayers, but it doesn't mean to say you can't carry on praying for that person. I'm just telling you to look outside your family to other people who've never heard about Jesus Christ, who know nothing about the gospel. Do you know there was a famous evangelist who paid for 100 people to come to Christ? He had names written down, and I've got a list of names at home, and I write them down, and I'm praying for that person. And sometimes I've been praying a long time, sometimes I've been praying for years for them. And this evangelist wrote down 100 names, and at his funeral, 97 people had given their lives to Christ. Isn't that fantastic? But God is never short. At his funeral, the last 3 gave their lives to Christ. He didn't know anything about it, did he? Until he got to heaven. But there's so many people out there who absolutely desperate to hear about Jesus' forgiveness. Do you know I had a man come into the chapel one day, and he walked into the chapel and said, what goes on in here then? I said, it's a chapel. He said, what's a chapel? I said, it's a church. He said, what's a church? I said, you don't know what a church is? He said, I've no idea. What's a church? I said, have you heard of Jesus? No. I said, have you heard of God? He said, yeah, I've heard of God. I said, well, come in and meet him. And at the end of that service, that man gave his life to Christ. I won't tell you which part of the country he came from, but he never heard anything about Jesus Christ. He was born in this country. But that's what we're finding now. Less and less people are hearing anything about. The children are not taught enough in the schools about Jesus Christ and so forth and everything else. And it's our job to actually tell these people. And they won't necessarily understand everything about it. I had a man come up to me and he said, I didn't realize that Jesus was a carpet fitter. I said, he's not a carpet fitter. He said, it says here he's a carpet fitter. I said, he was a carpenter. He said, that's what I said, he's a carpenter. I said, no. A carpenter is somebody who works with wood. He said, that's a chippy. I said, all right, Jesus was a chippy. He said, well, if Jesus was a chippy, why did it say he's a carpet fitter? I said, I don't know, you're bigger than me. Do you know, in Belmarsh prison, there used to be a security unit within the prison. There used to be another unit within the prison which held all the major drug dealers, all the major terrorists. It's inside the prison. You have to be searched yet again and so forth. And they brush your hair and look in your mouth, all sorts of things. And these were very, very, very dangerous people. And not only dangerous, but they had so many billions of money in drugs and things like that, could get escape and so forth. And going over there was quite a frightening experience, because these guys were heavy prisoners. Tough, to say the least. And my job was to, as a chaplain in this prison, was to do some sort of service for those who wanted to come to church on that particular area of the prison. So I went over there one Sunday, and there was about 5 or 6 men sitting in a room. And I said, I've come to do a service. And they just look at you, you know. And I said, well, I'll come and do a service. And they said, great. And it was Christmas time. So I thought, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I thought to myself, I'll tell them the story about Jesus being born in the stable, in the manger. So I started reading from Luke chapter 2, and I ended up by saying Jesus was born in a manger because there's no room in the inn, which that's what it says. And this big inmate turned up and said, in what? So I said, in the inn. What do you mean in the inn? You can't end a sentence on in. I said, no, it's an inn. Yeah, I know it's an inn. He said, you can't end a sentence on in. You've got to realise that I've got 5 or 6 very violent prisoners there who won't listen to reason or you try and explain anything. Anyway, fortunately, this other man stood up and said, I'll help them, Father David. Don't worry, I'll give him, I'll help him. He said, Jesus was born in a pub car park because there was no room in the pub. So he said to me, he said, go on then, David, read it again and read it properly. So I had to read it again and say, Jesus was born in a pub car park, there was no room in the pub. And then he said, what's this all about, a manager? I said, that's a manger, forget it, I'm not going through that business. So they don't necessarily have to understand everything. You know what I mean? We always start to think that people, they don't understand, therefore, I've had people, don't understand everything, still come to Christ. You can still come to Christ. They don't need to understand on it. I just want you to look a bit wider for your ministry this year. Look in verse 6, it says, so they went out and went from village to village, preaching the gospel and healing people everywhere. And healing people everywhere. The disciples left, and what happened? They left home and said, well, we've had a great time that we had with Jesus. No, they didn't do that. They told a few mates of theirs, they said, next time, once you come to the conference, the MLG conference, it's very good. No, they didn't say that either. They soon forgot about Jesus. They'd met with Jesus and went on as normal as if nothing had happened. No, they didn't do that either. They left, they traveled, they preached, they healed people everywhere. That's what they did. That's what we should be doing. Now in Matthew chapter 10, I just want to flick back to Matthew because it just gives us a little bit more detail in Matthew chapter 10. And I want to look at verse 7. It's all linked up to the first passage. As you go, this is Jesus talking to the disciples, preach this message, the kingdom of heaven is near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Right? That's what it says. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. It can't be any more specific than that. Heal the sick. Have you ever put hands on anybody to help them heal them? Or have you said, oh, I haven't got the gift. Don't ask me to pray for you. It might not work. Do you know, so many people think they haven't got the gift. You don't know whether you've got the gift unless God asks you to start using it. You know, I'm sure at home you've got hundreds and hundreds of Christmas gifts you've been given and you've accepted it, but you never used it. And I think God has given us so many gifts and he wants us to use those gifts. And heal the sick is one of them. You need to lay hands on people. It tells you in James that go back to the instruction book. I just left Oxford. I trained for 2 years in Oxford to be a vicar, and then you moved down to somewhere as a curate, so you're like a trainee vicar thing. And I was moved to the Isle of Wight. I've been there a week. And my wife had to go to hospital just for a checkup on something or other, and she was sitting there talking to another lady in the hospital. And she saw that this other lady had a very, very thin, sickly-looking son, about 12 years old. And she said, what's wrong with your son? I mean, got chatting to her. And the lady said, well, she said, I've taken this boy Mark, she said, to all these blooming specialists and everything else, but they don't know what's wrong with him because he can't swallow properly. He can drink liquids, soup and things like that, but he can't swallow any lump of anything. So my wife turned around to her and said, don't worry, my husband will come and pray with him. I wasn't even there. I knew nothing about this till I got home. And my wife said, I've done this. This is her number. Ring her. She's expecting your call at 6 o'clock. I never, ever laid hands on anybody at all. So I thought, well, obviously God's pushing me into something. So I rang the lady up, made a time to see her. I went over to her house, which she lived about 10, 15 miles away. I went there and she was sitting, her husband was sitting there and the sick boy, Mark, was sitting there and the sister was there and so forth and the wife sitting around the table. And they looked at me and I looked at them and I thought, now hang on a minute, what would Jesus do? Jesus would do pray. Well, I just think about it. I said, let's all pray. So they all put their heads down. I thought, thank goodness for that. I got that bit right. Got that done. Now, what do I do now? What would Jesus do? Jesus would lay hands. All right, I'll do that then. So I laid hands on him. I told him, I said, Mark, I'm going to lay hands on you. I said, I'm going to pray that God heals you. And I laid hands on him. I just said a simple prayer. I said, Lord, I said, this boy cannot eat anything. Don't know what's wrong with him. I don't know anything about him, I said, but I've come here just to pray for him. Amen. That's all I said. And we all had a cup of tea and I went home. Next day, she phoned up. She said, he's eaten a whole burger. Praise God for what God can do. So I wanted to go and lay hands on everybody I could think of. I thought, I've got the gift. I didn't know. I don't think I have got the gift, but I just think that God can use you. If you're put in a situation, then use that situation. Don't think you have to have a special word from God to say, actually, I've given you this gift and I want you to go and do it. Drive out demons. Drive out demons. You know, in the prison, I've met so many people who have been involved in occult and fortune telling and satanic rituals and all sorts of things. And I met a man once who had his hand and he asked to see me and I went to see him in the cell and I said, what is it? He said, I need help from God, he said, or from somebody. I said, what is it? He said, my hand. He said, I'm right-handed. He said, my hand is stuck like that. And he couldn't move his hand. He said, I've been to all the specialists and all the doctors and nobody knows what's wrong with it. Can you help me? I said, I can't help you. I said, but God can help you. He said, can he? He said, I said, God made you. Did he? He said, I said, yeah, he made you. I said, so first of all, we need to give your life to Christ. He said, how do I do that? I said, put your hand together. So he put his hands together and I said, I want you to say sorry to God. He said, I'm sorry, God. I said, for everything I've done wrong. He said, for everything I've done wrong. I then said to him, I said, I want you to ask for Jesus to come and take over your life. Jesus, take over my life. I said, you really mean it, don't you? He said, yes, I do. And with that, I laid my hands on him and he was filled with the Holy Spirit of God. He looked up at me and said, well, yeah, but what about my hand? I said, I'm going to pray over your hand. I said, I just need to have a prayer tonight. So I just shut my eyes and said, Lord, please tell me what is wrong with this man's hand. And the Spirit of God spoke to me and said, that is where he held the glass on the Ouija board. That's where he held. I said to him, have you been involved in Ouija boards? He said, I have. I said, that's why it is. And I prayed over his hand and he asked God's forgiveness for what he'd done. And God suddenly released his hand and he went leaping up and down and he went out the cell, he went run up and down the corridor and said, I can move my hand! And he told everybody about it. What a witness he was to people. And people knew that he'd had a bad hand. They saw what a miracle it was and they couldn't get over it. Drive out demons. Maybe you've been involved in something to do with fortune telling or stars or tarot cards, or whatever it is. Sometimes that happens to a lot of people, maybe in their past, maybe before they become Christians. And a lot of times you get a pain at the back of your neck. And the reason for that, I believe the reason for it is not a biblical reason, it's a reason I've worked through for the last 25 years, is the fact that when they get hold of a little child and you grab them by the back of the neck, you can control them wherever they go. And that's what the devil does. He controls us where we go. And it doesn't matter how many doctors and surgeons you go to, you'll never get rid of that pain. And if you've got a pain like that, or in the back of your head, or pains anywhere else because you've been involved in something, then I want you to come forward at the end of this service, and I will pray for you. Like I've done with thousands of other people. I've prayed with people, and people being freed from that thing through God's power. Not through my power, through God's power. So I'm just telling you, that's one thing you can come forward for prayer. Then it says here, cleanse those who have leprosy. Cleanse those with leprosy. Well, I've never dealt with anybody who's had leprosy. But I've dealt with plenty of people who are alcoholics. And plenty of people. And we had a young man came into the chapel one Sunday morning, and he was about 19 or 20 years old he was. And he came into the chapel, and he was shaking like this. He couldn't stop shaking. He said, can you help me? I said, God can help you. He says, I need God and I need him right now. And I prayed with him and he gave his life to Christ. I said, what started the shakes? He says, I've been drinking since the age of 8. He says, I've been drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking. And now I've got so many things, and I'm seeing things I shouldn't see and so forth. And in Proverbs 23:21, it says, if you drink that much, you will see strange sights. I said, are you seeing strange sights? The snakes. And he said, I can see things in front of me. I'm seeing odd visions at night. I can see things. I said, you've got delirium tremens. You've got DTs. It's a drink disease. He said, can God help me? I said, God can help you. I said, let's just pray over your hands. And I prayed over his hands and he stopped shaking immediately. And he used to come every week into the service and stand up in front of all the prisoners and said, look, no shakes. Because God had done a marvelous thing with him. And people say, but he hasn't said about raising the dead. What's he going to say about raising the dead? Now, you can use this in a metaphorical sense. People are dead in their sins before they come to Christ. Or you could be involved in raising somebody from the dead. I'm going to read you this story to you. And I'd like you just to bear with me when I read this story to you. First of all, I want to show you when I mention about it. I'm going to mention a picture Bible. That's a picture Bible. That's a Bible we used to give to prisoners, many who couldn't read and write. You can look at it afterwards, but it's come from America, but it's a picture Bible. And we used to give them picture Bibles. So that's what I'm going to talk about in a second. But I had a man who came into the prison. He was in for murder. And this is his story, because this man actually died in prison. And I want to read this story as he wrote it. He wrote it. I came to Horfield Prison, that's Bristol Prison, in 2009. At a time I did not have time for God in my life. I was dedicated to drugs and felt very low. I was sent to the hospital wing, because I tried to take my life before I came into prison. One day, David, the chaplain, came to my cell, and he asked me if I wanted God to help me. I said yes, and we prayed together. The empty hole that was inside me just filled up. David gave me a picture Bible, as I was unable to read. After a few months, a lot of things started happening. My granddad passed away. The mother of my child disappeared, so I was unable to see my daughter, and once again I started feeling empty. I began to get in trouble on the wing, arguing with the prisoners and officers. I started fighting the system. I fell back into drugs within the prison, and I ended up on the punishment block. I sat on the bed waiting, and then I ripped my T-shirt, tore it open into a rope. I made a noose around my neck, which I hung from the window, and I waited for the officer to come round and check on everybody. And as he raised the flap of the cell door, I kicked the bucket from underneath me, and I fell unconscious immediately and was soon dead. I was told that I was found, I was cut down, and they started trying to revive me without any effect. I was then rushed to hospital, where I was put on a life support machine. I was barely alive. My mum and dad were praying for me, for them. It went on for hours to days. The doctors came after I had a brain scan and told my mum and dad there was an 80% chance I'd be severely brain damaged. I'd be in a wheelchair, unable to feed myself, and the decision was made to turn off the life support machine. That happened on a Thursday evening. And on Sunday, he was still in the hospital on the life support machine. Everybody in the prison knew about it, because you can't keep things like that quiet when somebody's trying to commit suicide. And I told all the prisoners, I said, we're all going to pray for this man. We didn't pray for his recovery, we just prayed for him. We just prayed, and people were outpouring their prayers for him. And I met an officer who was a trained paramedic, who told me I worked on that man for half an hour trying to get his heart beating again while I waited for the ambulance, because it takes a long time for the ambulance to come through all the gates and everything else to get into the prison. Then my dad and my mum crying, my dad walked over to the life support machine and said his goodbyes. The machine was turned off, and all of a sudden, with a massive gulp of air, I started breathing normally. About a week later, I came around, I woke up, and my mum and dad were there. I didn't say anything for a few minutes. My mum grabbed hold of me and started crying. She whispered in my ear, I knew God will be there for you, she said. I said, why? She said, look in your hand. I was holding a cross that she'd given me since I was a child. I started crying. A few days went past in the hospital. They took me back to the prison. He came back to the prison. And I stayed in the hospital wing again for a few days before I went back onto the wing. I sat in my cell and I picked up a Bible and I found I could read. 2 miracles in one go. Brought him out of life, and he could read. 2 days later, he went to a Bible study with my friend Jim, and that's Jim over there, and he can confirm this is what happened, who told me that God was watching over me every step of the way, and I decided I needed to be baptized to show everyone what a miracle my life is and how powerful God is. I was clinically dead, and that it was impossible impossible for me to make a recovery. I now want to show everybody that even with just a little faith, you can experience the power of God in your life, and believe me, it is powerful. This is my story. I give God all the glory, and I want to share it with everybody. Praise God for that, because that was fantastic what God did. And he stood up in that chapel, and you could see the marks on his neck where he'd hung himself, and he gave his testimony week after week in the chapel. And because of that, many prisoners gave their lives to Christ. And I just thank you for that, because that is absolutely what happened. And the officer who was working on him said, unless I actually shake his hand and look into his eyes, he said, I will not believe that that man came back from the dead. I said, you know, there's a story in the Bible about that called Thomas, you know what I mean? But he didn't want to know. You see, Christianity is a belief that results in action. Jesus is the Lord who sends us out to change others' lives with his power. God has a purpose for you that is a way beyond your imagination. So you have big questions to think about tonight. Have I been half-hearted to spread the good news of Jesus Christ? Have you ever told anybody about it? Have I shared half the gospel with either too much emphasis on personal spirituality or too much on physical wholeness? In other words, do I have to feel as if I've got to get myself right before I can start speaking the gospel? You don't. Have I accepted that Jesus is sending me out into this world with his authority? Or have I been just too afraid? Have I realized how busy the world's needs are right now, and how am I part of God's answer to it? I've told you these stories tonight about people who have made a real difference in real circumstances. Will anybody be able to say that about those things to you, about you in that way? And if they did, what would they say? Jesus has sustained you this week in a wonderful way. He's now sending you out from this conference to make a difference and be bold for him, to help spiritually or physically. One day those disciples, those prisoners, and you and I will hear the Lord say, well done, my good and faithful servants, with those words, there can be no greater joy. Now in a few moments I'm going to ask you if you want to come forward for prayer. You can come forward for prayer for anything at all. Maybe you haven't given your lives to Christ, so you've got an opportunity tonight. I'll pray for you. You want a prayer for boldness, you come forward. If you want a prayer for forgiveness, you come forward. If you want a prayer for healing, come forward. Whatever your need, Jesus is listening. I just wonder if the band could play a little bit of music quietly in the background while the people came forward. Is that possible? Tim, is that all right? And if the prayer team want to come up and help with the prayers, you're very welcome. Or if he wants to pray with me, I'll just be standing over here. But please use this opportunity to come for prayer, because I don't want to go on the M5 anymore at the moment. So the longer we can delay it, the better I am. So I need more people to come forward than before.